the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today I have the pleasure of introducing you to astrological researcher George Coutts. Hi, George.
Hi, Jen. How you doing?
Doing great. Always love to chat with you.
Likewise. I'm so grateful and excited for the opportunity to be here.
Yay. Okay, so let's just cut straight to it. How did you get introduced to astrology through books? What was your first astrology book?
So when we were doing our initial intake, I had mentioned The Secret Language of Birthdays because that was the first book that a young George saw at a bookstore. You know, gave me all of the information that I needed to know about how astrology could be used to work out, how we're all different. But the real answer to this question goes a little bit further back. When I was a kid, I grew up in a really secular family, but my grandparents on my mother's side are immigrants from Greece to Canada. And so a big part of the, Greek diaspora's sort of reverence for their home country is their support and excitement about the church. And so my yaya taught at the Greek Orthodox Church here. She taught Sunday school. So she was, very well versed in the Bible. And I, heard all those stories growing up. I spent a lot of time with her. And I know the Bible's not necessarily an astrological book in any sense. I guess there are lots of people, I'm sure, who would hear me bring up the Bible and astrology and go, wait, there's probably a lot more disconnect there than there is connection. But one of the stories that stuck with me and is sort of like the nexus point for my interest is the story of Joseph and his, Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, where he's just this guy who gets this flamboyant coat from his dad, and his 11 brothers are jealous, but he's like telling people dreams and he's using the stars to interpret, he makes a huge prediction about how the crop is going to come up in Egypt. So there's this whole sort of like magical, mystical world of stars and dreams and stories that I learned from the Bible. And I guess sort of from there, things have sort of spiraled. And here I am writing a PhD in the history of astrology. So
I love that. History of astrology, PhD out of a fascination with the astro wizard Joseph in the Bible.
Yeah. And there are many of them, like the mages are in there. There are lots to talk about Abraham being one of the first Sabian astrologers. There's lots of stuff that we could get into if we really wanted to.
The Sophia Center just published a book last year about the Magi and the star, the sort of hypothesis that it could be a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, or perhaps it was a supernova. And Martin Wells is the author, and he comes to the conclusion, actually, ironically, that it's not astrological at all, and it's a literary device.
Right.
So,
it's astrological magic, not just the same. You know what I mean? It's all.
Yeah. And I thought, how ironic that we would have this book published by the only publisher that really goes into the history of astrology, the Sophia Center Press. And ultimately, the thesis at the end is it's not astrology, guys.
Right.
It's a story.
Right. But I mean, our astrology is better for having gone through those hoops.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, They modeled it off of astrology, probably. But, the whole, if you were to do all of the astronomical calculations and everything, and it's a pretty compelling, actually bold thesis because so many people want it to match up to something.
Right.
The people are convinced it has to be this. And it's he's like, it can also just be a story. Okay. So moving on. So we're going to put you. You're currently beaming in from Toronto, a city I've never been to but would love to visit, and apparently amazing astrologers come from there.
Highly recommend.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I would love to maybe take you down to Antarctica, and you can pack a bag, and you have 3 books that you can take with you. What are they?
Okay, first, I'd like to say I'd relish the opportunity to go to Antarctica. I'm very excited to have my moment alone to sort of get into the nitty-gritty of a book. I'm kind of already doing that, I feel, in a lot of ways.
Yes.
But my first book that I wanted to bring was De Vita Libri Tres by Marsilio Ficino, his 3 books on life. And my reason for choosing this book is because it's an astrological treatise. He definitely takes on astrology, especially in the third part of the book. But what it is at its core is an instruction manual for scholars who have the inclination to become melancholic, as he puts it. And he goes through instructions for how a scholar might not become miserable and depressed while in the throes of investigating whatever it is that they're studying. And so I imagine when I'm in Antarctica, I'm doing a lot of studying, I'm doing a lot of contemplating and writing. And I feel like having this book there with me as just like a guide to someone who's probably doing something similar to what I'm doing there. He gives a lot of really useful and important little tidbits for getting through. I would start there. I would bring that.
Very cool. So the cool thing too is that you'd still be able to do your PhD from there because it's a distance learning PhD.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you have any standout tips that Ficino gives that kind of stick for you that you're like, oh my gosh, I can implement that like right now?
Absolutely. I mean, so I've made a couple of notes here. One of my favorite headlines that he writes is he's got a chapter on the 5 enemies of the scholar, which are black bile, phlegm, sexual intercourse, gluttony, and sleeping in the morning.
Sleeping in the morning.
Sleeping in the morning, yeah. And black bile, phlegm, I'm like, okay, like I'm not entirely sure, but like the other 3, I'm like, okay, I see sort of where he's coming from here.
Yeah.
And the thing that he does in the book that I really like is he sets up a schedule for how the scholar's day should go.
Ooh.
And he doesn't say specifically that he's doing this, but if you're coming to it with the sense of, the sun and the houses and whatever, you get a really clear understanding that what he's doing is he's talking about how you should line up your day to where the sun is in terms of the houses, right? So he says super, super, super clearly that we got to wake up before the sun comes up over the horizon. Like we've got to have the sun in the first house to like inaugurate the day. And then as soon as the sun crests over the horizon, stop, meditate. It's when the sun's in the 12th house, we need to just not worry about doing anything. You're not going to get anything done. Just relax. And his instruction is to comb your hair. He says just like 100 times over and over.
Oh my gosh.
In the 12th
because
house.
the 12th house also rules jails and jail cells, and the hair comb is like a little mini, it's like a little bar's
brilliant
self-care.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's like, be gentle with yourself when the sun's in the 12th.
Exactly. And then as soon as, sun gets into the 11th, we know House of Good Fortune, we're like ready to like sit down and like write our treatise. And then, like take a break when like the sun gets into the 9th house to like rub some wine on your temples, which is something he recommends you do a lot just to sort of like keep the spirit of joviality and happiness.
Anoint yourself.
Yeah. So I figure I'm like, okay, when I get to Antarctica, I'm going to take this book. I'm going to work with the schedule because I feel like it makes a lot of sense. I do yoga in the morning after I get up. So I figure that's like a good sort of like equivalent to not doing anything, but just combing your hair and relaxing.
There's a catch though, because your houses will be very compacted.
Oh no.
You'll have to use whole sign or equal houses.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
The earth is a tangerine, and
I guess so. I mean, we could talk about the houses, but I think one of my favorite things about Ficino, and the reason why he's in my list, the only sort of practical manual book that I've included, is that he leaves a lot of open space for you to do whatever you need to do technicality wise, right? He doesn't give you any math. He doesn't give you any, like, this is what this means in this conjunction. Like, he doesn't talk about any sort of aspect. What he's doing, the way that I understand it, is he's saying, so there's this spirit flying around that feels like depression and melancholia. What we call that, based on, his reading of the classic Hellenistic philosophers, was like, we call that Saturn. We call that Chronos. And so some people have a daemon or a spirit that sort of inclines them to this spirit or feeling of like sadness and depression. What do we do when we get into that mode is we bring Venus in and we bring Jupiter.
We go to grad school.
Because he has a whole thing where he talks about like why someone would want to be a scholar in the first place, and he talks about why scholars like are so prone to becoming depressed, and he talks about how Saturn is this principle of heaviness and grounded and longevity and like hard tasks, and Mercury is this the spirit of investigation. And so scholarship and academia is essentially, according to Ficino, this collusion of Mercury and Saturn sort of coming together to try and get you to like take your investigative mind and turn it into a long, hard project.
I love that.
And then also another fun thing. So my research has a lot to do with the history of how gender and sexuality sort of come in and out of the astrological conversation. Something I've never heard anybody talk about before. Ficino might be one of our first or earliest examples of a queer astrologer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where does this come from in your research? How do you find that in him?
There's a queer historian named Rictor Norton who has a collection of books It's called My Dear Boy, Gay Love Letters Through the Centuries.
Oh,
And it's just basically a publication that takes love letters that people have written to each other throughout the centuries. And he goes back, some of his earliest poems or love letters come from the 12th century. One of them is Ficino's,
hey.
who had this relationship with one of his students named Giovanni Cavalcanti. They were, priests together, and they would hang out and they would exchange love letters with each other. And, you could hear this and go like, oh, well, we don't know that he was gay necessarily. Lots of people wrote letters, and the way that they talked about being friends was different back then. But you would have to really suspend your understanding of what a gay love letter is to not see these letters as very explicitly Ficino saying I love you, and I'm so happy that God put us here together. And he actually signs off one of the letters. The farewell is, "Farewell, O true companion of my voyage, my sweet reward upon arrival at our destination." But the original Italian, so the sweet reward, he calls it dolce condimento, which literally translated means sweet sauce.
Oh, I love
that. Yeah. I love you, my sweet sauce. You're my reward on my voyage towards God, and we're gonna do it together.
Dolce condimento.
Yeah, it's so funny.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And again, queer astrology, it's, there's a big movement started, pretty recently, but there is a case in the literature for this being something that's been happening for a very, very long time.
Amazing. Amazing. I love that new tidbit about Ficino's private life.
I know.
Totally fun. Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. So let's move on to your next book.
So the next book that I have chosen is Liz Greene's Relating. Liz Greene, I have the utmost respect for the astrologer. I think she has done so much to sort of push the vanguard. She's really taken a lot of really, really huge concepts that were lost at the time that she was writing them, but she's brought them forward in such a beautiful, poetic way of speaking. But the reason why I included this book is actually because her chapter on Victor's chart in it is what sort of set off the fire within me to get into researching the stuff that I'm researching, which is, again, has a lot to do with gender and sexuality and how these ideas come up through astrological literature. And so there are lots of things that could be said. But for listeners who are interested, I highly recommend looking up The Astrology of Homophobia, which is an article written by an Australian astrologer in the early 2000s named Peter Clamp. And he takes a lot of what was being written about sexuality, specifically homosexuality, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and really takes these astrologers to task and asks them, why are you saying these things? Where is this stuff coming from? Because, there's a lot of stuff that comes out in Liz Greene's writing, specifically in this chapter on Victor's chart. It's a lot less astrology and a lot more her taking what her cultural sphere was talking about at the time and working it into a way that we might understand how astrology can be used to speak about sexuality. But what she writes in this chapter amounts to a lot of, what might be hurtful things that she says about, what a homosexual is, right? She talks about how Victor, who is this character that she focuses her discussion on, is so possessed by his hatred for his mother that his overemphasis of his anima within him makes him basically have a limp wrist with the gentle lisp, tossing of his head, and the suggestive walk and swiveling hips and mincing steps, which turned him into a parody of inferior womanhood. And so we read these things and we're like, oh, okay, like, so like, fair enough, right? Like these are my wrists being limp and, I've got, like my gay way of speaking. But the fact that she's writing about it in this way, and then she goes on to say that the chart doesn't tell you anything about his sexuality, right? Without knowing that Victor's gay, you wouldn't be able to piece that together. But his chart does show you a person with a fine temperament who has issues with his mom. And what we know about homosexuality in the 70s, like she wrote this book only 4 years after homosexuality was taken out of the DSM.
Oh.
So we're dealing with like a cultural attitude towards homosexuality that isn't the one that we're currently living in necessarily.
Right.
There's no consensus on what homosexuality is. But she's talking about how Victor and his chart reflect someone who has issues with his mom. And so what turns Victor gay is his choice to take this hatred that he has of his mother and turn it into homosexual behavior. Like it's something as a gay person, like it's a little sticky to read and it doesn't feel nice. So it set me off on this journey of like, okay, like what is in the tradition? What else is being said about this? And then I found actually like the further you look back, the more you get where like what Liz Greene is doing in this book is not a new thing. Like Liz Greene is not the first person to make a statement like this. I have another one from Manilius's Astronomica, where he talks about the influence that the Pleiades might have on a man.
Oh, you're going all the way back.
But it's there, right? It's like a centuries old conversation that we're having, right? Where he talks about how a man born under the Pleiades will smooth their hairy limbs with the porous pumice, loathing their manhood and craving for sleekness of arm. They adopt feminine dress, footwear donned not for wear but for show, and an affected, effeminate gait. Right? Which is a pretty like almost word for word parallel to what Liz Greene ends up saying about, gay people being these, like limped wrists, effeminate, like whatever. And so like all that just to say, the reason we chose this book is because it had something in it that like set off such a fire in me to like really understand. Cause like I love Liz. I think she's one of the best astrologers. Like you could argue with me about it, but I could argue
but we'd lose, right?
Yeah, I could tell you things too. Yeah. But so like I'm reading it and I'm agreeing and I'm like, yes, like Liz, you're right. And then I get to this chapter and I'm like, oh my God, this makes me feel bad. And so that sent me off in a direction where now I'm like, I'm reading Manilius, I'm reading Ptolemy, who has a lot to say about sexuality. And in Diseases of the Soul is the chapter that he writes about sexuality in. But so my hope is to have a book that kind of makes you angry a little bit. And I hope that that anger turns into like, we don't need to do the 17th century astrology thing where we all come for each other and like predict each other's deaths. Like that might be a little messy. But like what we can do is get into the research, you know what I mean? Like, and learn more because like it's there.
The pen is the sword.
Yes, exactly. Is it ever?
When you get mad, don't get even, go to grad school. It's all about going to grad school. No, I hear you. Actually, there was a book that lit me up and made me mad that astrology wasn't in academia. And that set me off on, I'm 25 years in now, but this journey of let's find the sources, let's read these and let's put them in a position of let the sources speak. And that way we can understand what they are instead of already saying, well, this is pseudoscience or this doesn't work. And so that's what brought me to the Sophia Center. But what I'm hearing you say too is like, there are certain ways we can see our current cultural experience of sexuality and revise perhaps, or like go back and understand the journey that our communities have taken in understanding, what we're dealing with and not pathologizing people.
Absolutely. Oh, and then this is the point that I was going to make when I put the book on the list, was that this book taught me like very explicitly and very clearly that astrological writings are married to the time and place that they're written in, right? Yeah. There's no two ways about it, right? We have to like really, really, really understand not just what's being said, but who's saying it and why they're saying it and how they're using it. So there's an article in the CAELi Review by S.J. Anderson. If you haven't read the CAELi Review, please do. But it's the article where he talks about how astrology is articulated in the word, but then there's an animistic quality that requires us, like the literate astrologer, to pick up the words and recreate them again. And that process is like inescapable when we're talking about astrology, right? Like we have to recognize that like there's no way to like do traditional astrology anymore, right? Like the astrology being practiced today has the traditional text at the root, but it's a very modern astrology, right? Like you couldn't necessarily bring it back there and have it be completely understood by everyone hanging out there, right? Like you have to acknowledge the fact that like every time you do something, you're bringing it anew.
Right. The illusion that we could know what any historical astrologer was doing when they say, I do this, and they write it down in a book. It's like, okay, you say that, but what do you really do?
Right.
Dorian Greenbaum has pointed out in her work on Kepler's astrology that Kepler, for example, claimed at one point, well, I can't see a sign distinction between Aries and Taurus, and so these two things that aren't conjunct in an Islamicate astrology actually are conjunct. But the thing is, there were Islamicate astrologers who still saw that as a conjunction because they could see them together. And Kepler sometimes, the way that he would apply his aspect theory and like, things that he said were so, he actually didn't do when he was delineating charts.
Right.
So it's kind of like, you read both levels and then you have to also know, we can never really know what was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something Nick talks a lot about in his book. And every time we have a conversation, he reminds me, he's like, as much as we'd love to believe that the books faithfully document everything that was happening within astrology, there's just no way. And especially, like in the 17th century, when astrology gets kicked out of school, like it doesn't die. But it goes undocumented.
Underground. It goes underground.
Right? And at that point, like, the almanacs are being used for fertility astrology, which is like a huge deal, but no one's writing about it. It's not happening, but it's kicked out of the academy, right?
Right. Yeah. All right. What's your third book?
Okay, my third book, it's called What Does Joan Say? It's by Joan Quigley. The reason I'm bringing this book, it doesn't have any necessarily useful astrological information in it, but I'm a big fan of the Housewives. I'm a big fan of celebrity drama. I love a gossip column. And this, like Joan Quigley's life story and this book has all of it. Presidential intrigue, saving the world with astrology, bringing about world peace. So basically what happened, if you're not familiar with the story, is that Nancy and Ronald Reagan had been using an astrologer for years to do everything, basically. The story goes that the White House had a book that had the calendar highlighted with days where Air Force One was allowed to take off, where it wasn't allowed. It was this whole thing, and it caused a huge rift with their chief of staff, whose name was Donald Reagan, not Ronald Reagan. So when Donald Reagan quit, I guess he got fired. There's some ambiguity about what happened there. But he wrote a book basically exposing this astrologer scandal. And then everyone went wild on the Reagans. It was a huge thing in the national media. Nancy Reagan responded with her book called My Turn, where she basically does this thing where she says, oh, don't blame Ronald for this. This was all me. After the assassination attempt, I became this nervous and irrational woman, and I didn't know what to do with myself. So I figured, what do women do? We do astrology when we get scared, right? So that's what I was doing with that. Don't worry about this, all of this stuff. And then Joan is comes out with this book 2 years later where she's like, actually, Nancy, I did that. Like, how dare you say this about, because Joan is someone who's very, very, very obsessed with, like, she's Republican lady in the 80s, right? Like, she was obsessed with her image and her reputation. And she was obsessed with sort of not having astrology disrespected, right? She was very, very sure. She was one of the first person to say, like, there's no such thing as bad astrology, just bad astrologers, right? Like, her whole thing was that astrology is a science and I can do all of this stuff. So
those statements go way, 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 way back, almost to the beginning of people saying it's not the craft, it's the crafter, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So then she's, an important point in our lineage, right? Of Joan basically just turning this, like, and her tone, like the reason why I love it so much is because the tone is so nasty, right? Like, she's really angry at Nancy as she's writing this.
Wow.
And like, she should be, like, she had her reputation torn down and destroyed. And it's a fascinating story. And there are opportunities throughout astrological history for like moments like this, where astrologers are, historically a very, very funny and sometimes angry group of people who are not afraid to argue with each other. Like, especially in the printed word, right? Like, you go back to the 17th century, there's people like, like talking about William Lilly saying like, this is bogus, he's wrong, he has no idea what he's doing, and he's going to die this year, and I have his chart to prove it, right?
Or they were making fun of his name and calling him William Liley.
Oh my goodness.
Accusing him of being a liar.
Of course.
Right? Yeah.
That's so funny. Yeah, it's like, so I love messy drama, and astrology is full of it. That's why I would bring that book, just to kind of continuously remind myself that it's wild out there.
It's wild out there.
Yeah.
She's also got something else special about her. Joan Quigley is the only author with a Q last name in the books that I have here at CAELi.
Oh my goodness, you're kidding.
So I'm not saying there aren't other astrologers whose last names begin with Q. There might be, but if they've written books, they're not here. So if you find someone, let me know. But yeah, I think she's the only one.
I wouldn't be surprised. And she would probably love that for her.
I mean, in general, the one with the most books, the letter that has the most books, or last names that begin with M. I need to open up a whole new wing, actually, to like hold all the M books. Everybody's got a last name that starts with M. But I and Q and you are very low. So if you need to be like unique and special and take up space, change your last name to something that ends in Q. You'll be right next to Joan.
I could become George Quincunx.
There you go. Oh, that's so wonderful. I love that. I know.
Yeah, a game that my friends and I play is we come up with different funny drag names that a drag queen might use. And Quincunx, first name Quinn, last name Kunx, is always something that comes up. Everyone gets a kick out of that one. So
I'll go for Jenn Inconjunct so that I can be in the eyes and like look at you from across the room.
That sounds like we've got a drag duo, Rue.
I think so. Yes. My friend in grad school when I was at Berkeley, his name was Iona Muff, and I thought that was great.
So fun.
But another M last name. Too big.
Too big. We couldn't do that. No.
Okay. So if you were going to suggest to someone how to become a better astrologer, getting into astrology, a student, someone beginning who wants to learn, who's maybe new, where would you point them?
This is a very difficult question to answer because I have my book list is long. What I would recommend a person looking to get into or improve their astrological practice is to decide what it is that you're using astrology for. I think I spend a lot of time, especially at the Sophia Center, asking the question, what is astrology? What's the definition of astrology? Something that I've had to contend with myself. And I think it's a very difficult and like, frankly, kind of bad question, right? Because like you could ask like, what is a hammer? And you could say, oh, well, it's this thing that you use to hammer down nails. And then I could say, okay, but like, what about you using the hammer to take the nails out? What about you using the hammer as a weapon? What about you using a hammer as a decorative item on your mantle? To ask like, what is astrology forgets that there are a million different ways that astrology can be used. So it's when you ask, what are we using astrology for, that we sort of get like really good answers that are actionable and that actually like force us to improve what it is that we're doing. Yeah. So flowing from that, I think my strongest recommendation would be figure out the what. And to do that, I think you have to look into the history of what it is that astrology has been used for, right? Mm-hmm. We need astrological history books. A really good one, obviously, The History of Western Astrology is volume 1 and 2 by Nick Campion. They're, a gold standard, I think. They're very, very good books. And they are very rigorous and academic. But Nick does, even despite his academic rigor, have a way of communicating that does make a lot more sense than I think a lot of academicians do. So I highly recommend those books as a good place to start. But then also like look into general histories of things, right? Like I'm looking at gender and sexuality in astrology. And so, I'm reading proto-feminist literature. I stumbled upon Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication for the Rights of Women. And this book has absolutely nothing to do with astrology, but it's my particular focus within astrology. But then I was reading it one day and I found that she's got in one of her chapters a whole section about how astrologers make it difficult for men to see women as rational beings because women in the 18th century when she's writing are so obsessed with astrologers that she has a big problem with. So like, don't just limit yourself to books that have astrology in the title, right? Because astrology is insidious through history. It is everywhere.
It is everywhere. Yeah.
Everywhere.
Even in the Bible.
It's inescapable. And that's what I love about it, right? It really is. There's just an endless tome of things that can be spoken about.
Well, yeah. And now that you say that, it's actually interesting because if you crack open the tin can of astrology just a little bit, you do start to see how ubiquitous it is and how many people don't see how prevalent it is.
Right.
There's this strange disconnect between pop astrology and newspaper horoscopes, and then realizing that like the entire history of world literature, culture, and art is filled with astrological references.
Yeah. Oh, and it's wild, like the places where you find it too. It's just, and then anyway, sorry, I'm about to go on in like a whole.
I know we could go on forever and ever and ever and ever.
So
All
excited.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you're asking a question and not necessarily naming a specific book, because that's a really neat way of thinking about it, of like, well, if you want to use astrology for getting rich, then you would need to start looking at financial astrology techniques and then learn about that. And if you want to use astrology to heal your relationships, maybe look at the relationship style of astrology, right? So it's like, you got to think about your angle of approach, and that'll guide you to the right starting point.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, how can people find you, George?
Well, you can find me under a stack of books.
Okay.
Many deadlines.
Yes,
but
you're in PhD purgatory right now.
Yeah, I certainly am.
Okay.
You can send me an email. My email is grgcoutts@gmail.com.
Thank you for taking time to speak with me today in the midst of all of your research that you're doing.
Oh, such an honor and a pleasure, Jen. Thank you so much for everything that you do.
Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice. Rate it 5 stars or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.